The purpose of this video is to take us through the second part of the reader response, and that's the part where you analyze the article and decide whether it is persuading using logic, using emotion, or using an appeal to expertise. And so here's the outline I wrote, but in order to get here, I had to go through and analyze my article. And so that's what I want to walk you through, is how I analyzed the article to decide that it was an article based on logic and emotion. Okay, so here we go. I've made a Google Doc for you. Okay, so this is just a reminder of the 3 persuasive strategies. If you see ethos, you can recognize it because your writer is either an expert himself or he's using an expert in order to make his point. Logos is really just good writing, and it's where the writer tries to persuade by using logic, reasoning, facts, data, things that reasonable people can agree on. The last kind of persuasion is the trickiest, and that's where the writer is trying to persuade by getting you to feel something. Happiness, pride, anxiety, anger, and the writer will do this by using pictures, by using choosing words that are emotionally charged, maybe telling stories that will pluck at your heartstrings. The writer's just trying to get past your head and into your heart and into your gut. And you can't really figure this out unless you do a very close reading of your article. So I've given you the link to my article, but the only way I could figure out how to show you what I did was to take screenshots of the article and then annotate them for you. So we're going to walk through this article. It's going to be fast, and you can look at the PowerPoint afterwards more slowly and at your leisure. Okay, so this is the first page of the article. You got a picture of the Supreme Court building. Half of it is red, and then you've got this title, When the Supreme Court Lurches Right. I'm going to argue that both this and that word choice are emotional. And right there you can kind of get a sense of that writer's left-leaning bias that we talked about in the previous paragraph. So this is pathos, and then this is logos. Here the writer gets back some of the credibility by just being very, matter of fact. This article is going to be about what happens when the Supreme Court becomes significantly more conservative than the public. So here's the opener. I'm always telling you, open with a hook. She's doing the same thing. She is citing this guy. And this is going to be an appeal to ethos, an expert. She says he's the father of modern political science. And he published a canonical article, an article that's part of the canon about the Supreme Court. And so she opens up with an expert who says, yeah, the Supreme Court gets kind of out there every now and then, but it always comes back to the middle. It never stays away from public opinion for very long. And then she, I think, encapsulates a really important point. What is the role of the Supreme Court? When should the justices, who are unelected figures in robes, reflect the majority will? And when should they stand for right or justice so as to protect minorities from tyranny by the majority? And so right now we are on the brink of a Supreme Court that is going to see their role as this one, which is to protect minorities from the tyranny by the majority. But the kinds of tyranny they would be protecting the minorities from are things like a woman's right to choose, uh, homosexual marriage, um, voting rights, and so it's not a straight shot here. Okay, so look at the language. Placid moment, precipitous change. She uses language like this all through the article, and when I see it, I just mark it. Partisan rancor, fierce conflict, and then she's also a very good writer. And as you read through the article, you're going to see that she sets up then and now contrasts. And so here's the old Supreme Court, and these folks were actually trying to help minorities have a better life. Um, and then her contention is going to be that this new Supreme Court is still going to be a minority supporter, but it will be a minority supporter of those who would deny other people their rights. Okay, she does a lot of history lesson. She gives a lot of context. And in this paper that I'm imagining writing, I think a lot of this is going to show up in my third paragraph, the paragraph of how does this article help me write my own paper. You've got more emotional language, and she's taking a real us and them approach. Them would be the conservatives, and she's aligning herself with the left, which we knew she would do based on her biography. Um, Fulfillment of the dearest political wish, fifth and decisive brick of a conservative Supreme Court wall is about to be put in place. And of course, this was written during the Justice Kavanaugh hearings. This doesn't even anticipate the current hearings that are going on right now. Here, more context where she is establishing that the majority of Americans will be holding different opinions from the Supreme Court conservative majority. The majority of Americans approve of Roe v. Wade. The majority of Americans don't really like Citizens United. The majority of Americans want the ability to sue a big corporation or a bank. And the conservative supreme minority is positioned to rule against all of those ideas. The majority of Americans also support the idea of health care, which the conservative Supreme Court may very well gut in the next few weeks. Okay, more emotional language. You can tell that she's biased in a left-leaning way because she kind of ignores the fact. She says, oh, Brown versus Board was a great thing. And of course it was a great thing, but it created a lot of violence. And we're still experiencing a lot of violence. The alternative, of course, would be to go back to the point um, where black people are are relegated to a second class citizenship, but nevertheless, she doesn't really paint a completely fair picture here. Uh, okay, now we're going to do super history lesson. She's transitioning to the next part of her article where she gives us historical examples of where the Supreme Court was out of touch with what the majority wanted. And in her view, the Supreme Court was actually on the wrong side of history. See, I didn't mark this, but look at that language. Decisions that landed like thunderclamps. The court cemented a vision of the Constitution that most Americans no longer held. Now, she's not pulling any punches or trying to be at all objective there. I hope you'll read through this. It's fascinating. But she draws a conclusion for us, or she gets her expert to draw a conclusion for us. And look how interesting that is. We don't have to depend on her to conclude that the Supreme Court being on the wrong side of history almost tore the nation apart during the Civil War. Instead, she offloads that to her expert. And once you have an expert, it's harder to contest that. More history lessons. More history lesson, this time with FDR. And he was the one who was criticized for wanting to pack the court. And of course, that is a charge that's being thrown against Joe Biden and the Democrats right now, should they take the election. More emotional language. More emotional language, and now kind of a logical speculation on what could a conservative court do to undo Roe v. Wade. And so using these triggering words, but then, arguing with reasoning. And do notice all of these hyperlinks, these are things that you could follow and get even more background. Notice the violence of the language. And she does draw a conclusion for us. What's going to happen if the Supreme Court is conservative and the electorate is not? The principle of judicial independence is the loser. More logical argumentation, and here's where she gets scary. And to be fair, she's only scary for somebody who holds the same philosophy that she does. But in these articles, she makes the argument that the Supreme Court could restrict voting so rigorously that finally only the elite will be able to vote, and a lot of people who could benefit from a broader, more inclusive sort of rulings, they just won't have a voice. And then here's her conclusion. More emotional language, long darkness of the Supreme Court, recalcitrance. She basically blames the Republican Supreme Court of the 30s for the Great Depression. And she ends on an emotional level. She ends by trying to scare her reader. And she says, if things keep going the way they are, we may not have a democracy anymore. We may have a country that's ruled by only the elite. And so basically the argument I would make in this article is that she's done a lot of homework. She's done a lot of logical, historical context setting, but her main way of persuading is to scare the reader. And that would be an appeal to pathos.